What happens when a forgotten talent meets an unexpected opportunity? In the heart of New York City, a struggling vocalist and a powerful real estate mogul cross paths in a way that neither of them could have predicted. What starts as a simple request for a song turns into a journey of healing, legacy, and second chances. But will they find what they're truly searching for? Stay tuned, this is a story you won't want to miss. It was a crisp Friday evening in New York City, the kind where the city lights shimmered like diamonds against the dark sky. The Golden Fork, an upscale restaurant tucked into the heart of Manhattan, buzzed with its usual air of sophistication. Crystal chandeliers hung low over white linen tables, casting soft glows on diners who whispered secrets behind expensive wine glasses. And there, weaving through the crowd with quiet precision, was Marcus Carter. Marcus wasn't just any waiter, he was a man carrying two lives within him. By day, he trained his voice in small practice rooms, pouring hours into scales and arpeggios that echoed off empty walls. By night, he donned a black vest and tie, balancing trays of gourmet dishes for New York's elite. It wasn't the life he'd dreamed of when he graduated top of his class from Juilliard, but dreams didn't pay rent, and dignity had to be earned one paycheck at a time. Tonight, though, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the room seemed brighter than usual, or how the chatter of patrons carried an electric hum. Or maybe it was because tonight, seated near the grand piano by the window, was Victoria Lancaster. Victoria was the kind of woman who commanded attention without trying. Her sleek blonde hair framed sharp cheekbones, her tailored red dress hugging every curve. She was celebrating her birthday with a table full of powerful friends, real estate moguls, venture capitalists, even a senator or two. They laughed loudly, clinking champagne flutes as if the world existed only for their amusement. As Marcus approached their table to refill water glasses, Victoria glanced up. Her eyes locked onto his name tag, then traveled slowly to meet his gaze. There was something piercing about her stare, as if she could see straight through him. "You," she said suddenly, pointing a manicured finger at Marcus. "You're new here, aren't you?" Marcus froze mid-pour. He forced a polite smile. "No, ma'am. I've been working here for nearly 3 years. Victoria replied, leaning back in her chair. She tilted her head thoughtfully. "You look interesting. What do you do when you're not waiting tables?" The question caught Marcus off guard. For a moment, he considered brushing it off with a vague answer, something safe, something neutral. But before he could respond, one of Victoria's guests chimed in. "I heard him singing earlier," the man exclaimed, turning to the group. "Didn't you hear him? When he brought our appetizers, he hummed this little tune. It was beautiful." Marcus's stomach sank. He hadn't realized anyone was listening. Singing under his breath while working was a habit he couldn't shake, a reminder of the life he'd left behind. Well, Victoria said, her lips curling into a sly grin. "A singer, are we? How delightful. You simply must entertain us, Marcus." The request hung in the air like smoke after a firecracker. Marcus blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. "I'm sorry, Ms. Lancaster, but I'm here to serve your meal, not perform." "Oh, come now," Victoria pressed, her tone shifting slightly. Beneath the charm lay a steely edge. "Surely someone with your talent wouldn't deny us such a treat. After all, isn't that what art is for? To bring joy to others?" Her words were smooth, almost hypnotic, but Marcus felt the weight of them pressing down. This wasn't a request, it was an order wrapped in silk. Around the table, heads nodded in agreement. Encouraged by Victoria's confidence, her guests began to join in. "Go on, Marcus. Give us a song. Just one verse, it'll make her night. Don't be shy, we won't bite." Each comment added another brick to the wall closing in around him. Marcus swallowed hard, his hands tightening around the tray. He hated this feeling, the pressure to conform, to perform for people who saw him as nothing more than a spectacle. Yet, deep down, there was also a flicker of longing. Longing to let the music out, to feel the rush of notes spilling from his soul once again. But not like this. Not as some parlor trick for strangers. "I appreciate the enthusiasm," Marcus said finally, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "But I'm afraid I can't oblige. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to check on your main course." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a ripple of murmurs. Victoria watched him go, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the tension in the room eased, but only for a moment. Because everyone knew, including Marcus himself, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The restaurant hummed with quiet tension as Marcus retreated to the kitchen. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the conflict raging inside him. He could still hear the murmurs from Victoria's table, feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. But he'd made his choice, or so he thought. Back in the kitchen, Marcus busied himself refilling water pitchers and arranging silverware, anything to keep his mind off what had just happened. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, the image of Victoria's piercing gaze lingered. She wasn't going to let this go. And then it came, the call that sealed his fate. "Marcus." The head chef, a gruff but fair man named Tony, poked his head out of the kitchen door. "Table 7 wants you." Again. Marcus sighed, setting down the tray he'd been organizing. "Tony, I already told them." "I know what you told them," Tony interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "But they're insisting. And trust me, kid, when someone like Victoria Lancaster insists, you don't say no twice." Marcus clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Still, he nodded and straightened his vest. If this was the price of keeping his job, so be it. When he returned to Victoria's table, the room fell silent. All eyes were on him, expectant, curious, some even amused. Victoria sat at the center of it all, her expression unreadable. She gestured toward the grand piano by the window. "There," she said simply, her voice carrying an undeniable authority. "Sing for us there." For a moment, Marcus considered refusing again. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way the other diners leaned forward in anticipation, or the faint glimmer of vulnerability he saw in Victoria's eyes, a crack in her otherwise impenetrable facade. Whatever it was, it stirred something deep within him. Without a word, Marcus walked to the piano. He sat down on the bench, his fingers hovering over the keys. For years, he'd suppressed his gift, burying it under layers of practicality and necessity. But now, sitting here in front of a room full of strangers, he felt it rise to the surface once more. He took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes of Amazing Grace filled the room, soft and hesitant at first, like a whisper carried by the wind. Then, as Marcus found his rhythm, his voice joined in, a rich, soulful baritone that seemed to resonate through every corner of the restaurant. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Time seemed to stand still. Conversation ceased, forks froze mid-air, and even the clink of glasses faded into silence. Every person in the room was transfixed, drawn into the raw emotion pouring out of Marcus. His voice wasn't just singing, it was telling a story of struggle, resilience, and redemption. At Victoria's table, the transformation was palpable. Her smirk had vanished, replaced by an intensity that bordered on awe. As the melody washed over her, memories long buried began to surface. She remembered standing beside her father in a small church in Connecticut, listening to this very hymn echo through wooden pews. She remembered the warmth of his hand on hers, the steadiness of his faith, and the pain of losing him too soon. Tears welled up in her eyes, though she blinked them away quickly, unwilling to let anyone see her vulnerability. Around her, others were less guarded. A woman dabbed at her cheeks with a napkin, while a man stared blankly at his plate, lost in thought. Even the senator, who rarely showed emotion in public, looked visibly moved. Marcus sang the final note, letting it hang in the air like a benediction. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the room. It started with a few scattered claps, then grew louder and more insistent until the entire restaurant erupted in thunderous ovation. But Marcus didn't bask in the praise. Instead, he rose from the piano bench and returned to his duties as if nothing had happened. He picked up his tray, adjusted his tie, and resumed serving tables, his movements deliberate and composed. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like he hadn't been affected at all. Yet, as he passed Victoria's table, their eyes met briefly. There was no smugness in her expression now, only a quiet acknowledgement of what had transpired between them. Whether it was respect, admiration, or something else entirely, neither of them could say. For Marcus, the night continued much as it always did. Orders were taken, meals were served, and dishes were cleared. But somewhere deep inside, something had shifted. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder if perhaps his music still had a place in the world, not as a relic of his past, but as a living, breathing part of who he was. And for Victoria, the evening left an indelible mark. As she sipped her champagne and laughed at a joke one of her guests made, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd witnessed something extraordinary. Something that reminded her of the power of grace, not just in song, but in life itself. The next morning, Victoria Lancaster sat alone in her corner office on the 45th floor of a sleek Manhattan skyscraper. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden hues across the polished mahogany desk and minimalist decor. But Victoria wasn't admiring the view. Instead, her gaze was fixed on a small, framed photograph propped up beside her laptop. It was an old picture, faded but still vivid enough to capture the essence of the woman in it. Elizabeth Lancaster, Victoria's mother, smiled back at the camera, her hands poised over the keys of a grand piano. She had been beautiful, talented, and destined for greatness. At least, that's what everyone said before the world decided she didn't belong. Elizabeth's career had ended not because of lack of skill, but because of the biases of an industry unwilling to embrace a black female pianist in the 1970s. Offers dried up, critics turned cruel, and eventually, she walked away from the stage altogether, retreating into a quiet life as a music teacher in Connecticut. To Victoria, who was only 5 when her mother passed away, Elizabeth remained both an enigma and a source of quiet pain, a reminder of dreams deferred and battles fought silently. As Victoria stared at the photograph, fragments of memories surfaced. She remembered sitting on the edge of the piano bench as a child, watching her mother play Clair de Lune with such grace it brought tears to her eyes. She remembered the way Elizabeth would hum along softly, her voice trembling with emotions she never spoke aloud. And she remembered the emptiness that settled in their home after the music stopped, for good. Last night's performance by Marcus Carter stirred something deep within Victoria. His voice hadn't just filled the restaurant, it had awakened echoes of her own past, of her mother's unspoken sacrifices. There was a parallel there, undeniable and haunting. Like Elizabeth, Marcus carried a weight, a burden of talent suppressed by circumstance. Victoria leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen absently against the desk. Her mind raced with questions. Who was Marcus Carter, really? What drove him to trade his art for a waiter's uniform? And why did he seem so reluctant to share his gift with the world? She reached for her phone and dialed her assistant, Claire. Claire, Victoria said briskly when the line connected, I need you to look into someone for me. Of course, Ms. Lancaster, Claire replied, her tone professional and efficient. Who is it? Marcus Carter. He works at the Golden Fork. Find out everything you can about him, his background, education, anything notable. And make sure it's thorough. There was a pause on the other end of the line. May I ask why, ma'am? Victoria hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. Let's just say I'm curious, she said finally. And curiosity, Claire, is often the first step toward opportunity. With that, she ended the call and returned her attention to the photo. For a long moment, she simply sat there, lost in thought. Then, almost instinctively, she opened the bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out a dusty leather-bound journal. It was one of Elizabeth's, an heirloom Victoria had kept hidden away for years. Flipping through its pages, she found notes scrawled in her mother's elegant handwriting. Musical notations, lyrical fragments, and personal reflections spilled across the paper like whispers from another time. One entry caught her eye. Music is more than sound, it is a bridge between souls. To silence it is to sever that connection. Yet sometimes, silence is the only choice we are given. Victoria read the words over and over, feeling their weight settle in her chest. They resonated with her now in a way they never had before. Wasn't that exactly what Marcus had done? Silenced his music because the world, or perhaps his own fears, had left him no other choice. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," Victoria called, quickly closing the journal and sliding it back into the drawer. Claire entered, holding a tablet. "Ms. Lancaster, I've started compiling information on Marcus Carter. Early findings suggest he attended Juilliard and graduated top of his class. Afterward, he pursued a career in opera but, well, let's just say things didn't go as planned." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "It seems he faced some setbacks," Claire continued. "Critics praised his talent, but opportunities were scarce. Eventually, he disappeared from the scene entirely. No interviews, no performances, nothing. Until last night, apparently." Victoria nodded slowly, piecing together the fragments of Marcus's story. So, he wasn't just another struggling artist trying to make ends meet. He was someone who had tasted success, only to have it slip through his fingers. "And his current situation?" she asked. "He lives modestly," Claire replied. "Works full-time at the Golden Fork, though rumors suggest he still practices privately. Neighbors mention hearing him sing late at night." Victoria leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "Late-night rehearsals, huh? Interesting." Her mind began to churn with possibilities. If Marcus truly was as gifted as she suspected, and as haunted by his past as her mother had been, then perhaps there was a way to help him reclaim what he'd lost. Not out of charity, but out of recognition of potential wasted. But helping Marcus wouldn't be easy. People like him didn't trust easily, especially those who came bearing gifts wrapped in power and privilege. Still, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than coincidence. That somehow, fate had placed Marcus in her path for a reason. She glanced once more at her mother's photograph, then stood and walked to the window. Below, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing in her mind. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain: Victoria Lancaster didn't believe in leaving talent untapped, or stories unfinished. It was nearly midnight when Marcus finally stepped out of the Golden Fork, his apron folded neatly over one arm and a tired sigh escaping his lips. The streets of Manhattan were quieter now, the relentless energy of the day giving way to a softer hum. He pulled his coat tighter around him against the crisp autumn air and began the familiar walk toward the subway station. But tonight, something, or rather, someone, was waiting for him. Leaning casually against a sleek black sedan parked just outside the restaurant was Victoria Lancaster. Her red trench coat caught the glow of the streetlights, and her sharp gaze locked onto Marcus the moment he appeared. "Ms. Lancaster?" Marcus said, surprise evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" Victoria pushed off the car and took a step closer, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. "I wanted to talk to you," she said simply, her tone direct but not unkind. "Do you have a minute?" Marcus hesitated, glancing at his watch. It's been a long night, ma'am. Can this wait until another time? It could, Victoria replied, her expression unwavering. But I don't think it should. Something in her demeanor, a mix of authority and genuine curiosity, made Marcus pause. Reluctantly, he nodded. All right. What is it you want to discuss? Victoria gestured toward a nearby bench tucked beneath the shadow of a lamppost. Let's sit. This might take a moment. They settled onto the bench, their breath visible in the cool night air. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then Victoria reached into her bag and pulled out a folder filled with papers. She handed it to Marcus without explanation. What's this? He asked, flipping it open cautiously. Inside were newspaper clippings, reviews, and photographs, all dated several years ago. There was Marcus, younger and more hopeful, standing center stage in a tuxedo at Carnegie Hall. Another showed him accepting an award from Juilliard. The headlines praised his once-in-a-generation voice and predicted a meteoric rise to fame. Marcus's throat tightened as he flipped through the pages. Memories flooded back, memories he'd worked hard to bury. Where did you get these? He asked quietly, his voice tinged with unease. I have resources, Victoria replied matter-of-factly. And questions. Why did you stop? You had everything going for you. Marcus closed the folder and set it aside, his jaw tightening. It's complicated. Try me, Victoria pressed, leaning forward slightly. I'm not asking out of idle curiosity. I saw you last night, Marcus. That wasn't just talent, it was passion. So why throw it away? Marcus let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Throw it away? Is that what you think I did? Trust me, Ms. Lancaster, no one throws anything away willingly. Sometimes life makes choices for you. And what choice did life make for you? Victoria asked, her tone softening ever so slightly. Marcus stared at the ground, weighing whether to answer. Finally, he spoke, his words measured but heavy with emotion. The industry chewed me up and spat me out. Critics loved me 1 week, then tore me apart the next. Producers wanted a certain image, a certain sound, and I didn't fit the mold. After a while, the rejections piled up, and so did the bills. Singing wasn't paying the rent anymore. Waiting tables was. Victoria listened intently, her expression thoughtful. When Marcus finished, she nodded slowly. I understand more than you might think, she said. My mother was a pianist. Brilliant, really. But the world wasn't ready for her either. Marcus glanced at her, surprised. Your mother? Elizabeth Lancaster, Victoria explained. She could have been one of the greats, but instead, she spent her later years teaching piano to kids in Connecticut. Talent doesn't guarantee success, Marcus. Not in this world. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of shared understanding hanging between them. Then Victoria straightened, her tone shifting to something more resolute. That's why I'm here, she continued. I want to offer you something, a chance to reclaim what you lost. My mother left behind a music studio when she passed. It's been sitting empty for years, collecting dust. I'd like you to take it over. Run it however you see fit. Teach, perform, create, it's yours to shape. Marcus blinked, stunned. You're serious? Completely, Victoria replied. The space is fully equipped, and I'll cover the costs to get it up and running again. All I ask is that you use it to do what you were meant to do, share your gift with the world. Marcus stared at her, his mind racing. The offer was tempting, almost too good to be true. But doubt crept in quickly. Why would you do this for me? We barely know each other. Because I believe in second chances, Victoria said firmly. And because I see pieces of my mother in you. She never got hers, but maybe you can still have yours. Marcus looked away, wrestling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, the idea of returning to music, to a life he thought he'd lost forever, was exhilarating. On the other, the scars of failure ran deep, and trust didn't come easily. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "This is a lot to process." "I'm not asking for an answer tonight," Victoria said, standing and brushing imaginary lint from her coat. "Take some time to think about it. But don't wait too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often." With that, she turned and walked back to her car, leaving Marcus alone on the bench with the folder in his lap. As her sedan disappeared into the night, Marcus opened the folder once more, staring at the old photograph of himself on stage. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a different future, one where his voice wasn't confined to quiet rehearsals or whispered melodies late at night. One where it soared freely, touching lives the way it had touched Victoria's. But was he ready to take that leap? Only time would tell. The next afternoon, Marcus found himself standing in front of a weathered brick building on the outskirts of Brooklyn. The sign above the door read Lancaster Music Studio in faded gold letters, its edges chipped and worn from years of neglect. It wasn't much to look at, just another forgotten relic in a city full of them, but something about it tugged at Marcus's heart. Victoria had sent him the address earlier that morning with a simple text, "Come see it for yourself." Now, as he pushed open the creaky wooden door and stepped inside, he felt like he was stepping into another world entirely. The air smelled faintly of dust and aged wood, but beneath it lingered the ghost of music past. Sunlight streamed through cracked blinds, illuminating shelves lined with sheet music, instruments covered in protective cloths, and walls adorned with framed photographs of Elizabeth Lancaster performing in concert halls long since closed. Marcus wandered deeper into the space, his footsteps echoing softly against the hardwood floors. In one corner stood a grand piano, its once polished surface dulled by time. Beside it was a stack of vinyl records, their labels yellowed but still legible. He ran his fingers over the spines, reading titles that spoke of classical masterpieces and jazz standards. Memories began to flood back, memories of his own early days in music. Late nights spent practicing scales until his fingers ached. The thrill of his first recital, where his mother sat beaming in the front row. The crushing disappointment of rejection letters and cancelled performances. As he stood there, lost in thought, Victoria appeared in the doorway. She carried a clipboard under one arm and wore an expression of quiet determination. "I see you've made yourself at home," she said, her voice breaking the silence. Marcus turned to face her, gesturing vaguely at the room. "This place, it's incredible. But why hasn't anyone used it?" "Life got in the way," Victoria replied simply. "After my mother passed, I couldn't bring myself to let anyone else touch it. It felt too personal, too sacred. But now," she paused, glancing around the studio with a mix of nostalgia and resolve. "Now, I think it's time for it to live again." She stepped further into the room, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "I envision this as more than just a music studio. It could be a hub, a place where artists like you can create without fear of judgment or failure. Workshops, performances, mentorship programs, it all starts here." Marcus listened intently, though skepticism still lingered in his eyes. "It's a beautiful dream, Ms. Lancaster. But dreams take work. And money." "I'm aware of that," Victoria said firmly. "Which is why I'm committed to making it happen. Renovations will begin next week. New equipment, fresh paint, updated acoustics, the works. All I need is someone to lead the charge. Someone who understands what it means to fight for your art." Her gaze locked onto his, unwavering. "That's where you come in, Marcus." He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her stare. "You're asking me to take on a lot. Running a studio isn't easy, especially when you're trying to rebuild your own career at the same time." "I'm not asking you to do it alone," Victoria countered. You'll have resources, support, and freedom to shape the studio however you want. Think of it as a partnership, not just between us, but between you and the legacy of this place." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked over to the grand piano and lifted the protective cloth covering it. Beneath lay keys yellowed with age but still intact. Slowly, almost reverently, he sat down on the bench and pressed a single key. The note rang out clear and true, cutting through the dusty silence like a bell tolling in an empty church. Marcus hesitated, then played another, and another, until a simple melody began to form. It was hesitant at first, tentative, as if testing the waters. But soon, the music flowed more freely, filling the room with warmth and life. Victoria watched silently, her arms crossed over her chest. There was no smirk, no smugness, only a quiet satisfaction, as if she'd known all along what would happen when Marcus touched those keys. When the final note faded, Marcus rested his hands on his knees, staring at the piano. "This feels surreal," he admitted softly. "It should," Victoria said, stepping closer. "Because this is where your story begins again, if you let it." Marcus looked up at her, uncertainty still clouding his features. "What if I fail? What if I can't live up to whatever vision you have for this place?" Victoria knelt beside him, meeting his gaze directly. "Failure isn't the end, Marcus. It's part of the process. My mother taught me that. And maybe, just maybe, this studio can teach you the same thing." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air, mingling with the lingering notes of Marcus's impromptu performance. Finally, Marcus exhaled slowly and nodded. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. "But, thank you. For believing in me, even when I don't believe in myself." Victoria smiled faintly, standing and brushing off her knees. "Belief is contagious, Marcus. Maybe some of mine will rub off on you." With that, she left him alone in the studio, the sunlight streaming through the windows casting golden patterns across the floor. As Marcus sat there, surrounded by echoes of the past and possibilities of the future, he allowed himself to wonder, for the first time in years, if maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance after all. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus and Victoria threw themselves into renovating the Lancaster music studio, transforming it from a forgotten relic into something vibrant and alive. Scaffolding lined the walls, paintbrushes streaked fresh coats of color across faded surfaces, and the scent of sawdust mingled with the faint hum of power tools. Marcus arrived early each morning, sleeves rolled up and hands calloused from years of hard work, not just as a singer, but as someone who'd learned to fix what was broken. He worked alongside contractors, offering input on everything from acoustics to lighting. Meanwhile, Victoria handled the logistics, securing permits, negotiating budgets, and fielding calls from skeptical investors. At first, their partnership was strained. Marcus struggled to trust Victoria's intentions, while she grew frustrated by his reluctance to fully commit. But over time, shared challenges forged an unspoken bond between them. They began to see each other not as employer and employee, but as collaborators united by a common goal. One afternoon, as they stood in the newly renovated main hall, Marcus glanced around at the progress they'd made. The once dull walls now gleamed with warm tones, and the grand piano had been restored to its former glory. Framed photographs of Elizabeth Lancaster still adorned the space, but new ones, of Marcus, Victoria, and the renovation team, were beginning to join them. "This is starting to feel real," Marcus said, running a hand along the polished banister of the staircase. "It is real," Victoria replied, her tone firm but tinged with pride. "And it's only the beginning." But reality wasn't without its obstacles. Funding proved tighter than expected, forcing them to make compromises. A local community board meeting turned contentious when residents voiced concerns about gentrification, accusing Victoria of using the studio as a vanity project rather than a genuine effort to help the neighborhood. "They think I'm trying to clean up the area," Victoria muttered one evening after a particularly heated session. She sat slumped in a folding chair, exhaustion etched across her face. Marcus handed her a cup of coffee and leaned against the wall beside her. "Maybe they're scared," he suggested gently. "Change always feels threatening until people see how it benefits them." "And how do we show them that?" Victoria asked, looking up at him. "By doing what we said we'd do," Marcus replied simply. "By opening our doors and letting the music speak for itself." True to his word, the studio welcomed its first students just weeks later. Word spread quickly through flyers, social media posts, and grassroots outreach efforts led by Marcus himself. On the day of the open house, families poured in, parents clutching nervous children's hands, teenagers carrying beat-up guitars or battered violins, even a few elderly neighbors curious to reconnect with their musical roots. Among them was a young boy named Jamal, no older than 10, whose wide eyes lit up at the sight of the grand piano. His mother explained that he'd been teaching himself chords on an old keyboard borrowed from a friend. Another student, Sophia, a high school senior with dreams of composing film scores, shyly admitted she'd never had access to formal training before. As Marcus greeted each newcomer, memories of his own childhood flooded back, the same hunger for knowledge, the same fear of rejection. These kids weren't so different from the boy he'd once been, eager yet uncertain, searching for a place where they belonged. That evening, after the last student left, Marcus lingered in the studio, tidying sheet music and straightening chairs. Victoria found him there, lost in thought. "How did it go?" she asked, leaning against the doorway. Marcus smiled faintly, shaking his head in wonder. "Better than I expected." "They're amazing, Victoria. So much potential. It reminds me of why I started this journey in the first place." Victoria stepped closer, her expression softening. "You've come a long way since that night at the Golden Fork, Marcus. You know that, right?" He chuckled, though there was a hint of sadness in his laugh. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready to step back onto a stage. But this," he gestured around the room, taking in the instruments, the freshly painted walls, the echoes of laughter and music still lingering in the air. "This feels like enough for now." Victoria nodded, understanding more than she let on. "It's okay to take things one step at a time. Just remember, you're not alone anymore." For the first time in years, Marcus believed her. As he locked up the studio and walked out into the cool night air, he felt a flicker of hope, a quiet certainty that maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild not just the studio, but himself. The studio was beginning to find its rhythm. Students came and went, their laughter and music filling the halls with a vibrancy that Marcus hadn't felt in years. Yet, despite the progress, shadows of the past lingered, not just for Marcus, but for Victoria as well. One crisp autumn morning, as Marcus prepared for his first advanced vocal workshop, an unexpected visitor arrived. Standing in the doorway of the studio was Mr. Harold Grayson, Marcus's former mentor from Juilliard. The man who had once called Marcus the voice of a generation now looked older, his hair more silver than gray, but his piercing gaze remained unchanged. "Marcus," Grayson said, his tone measured yet tinged with reproach. "I heard you were back in the game. Thought I'd see it for myself." Marcus froze, his hands clutching a stack of sheet music. "Mr. Grayson, what are you doing here?" "I read about this place in the paper," Grayson replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the freshly painted walls and polished instruments. "Looks like you've been busy." "It's not mine," Marcus clarified quickly. "I'm just helping run it." Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Helping? Or hiding again?" The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He set the music down on the piano and turned to face his old mentor. "What do you want, Mr. Grayson?" I want to know why you threw away everything we worked for, Grayson said bluntly. You had talent, Marcus. Real talent. And you let it slip through your fingers because the world didn't hand you success on a silver platter. It wasn't that simple, Marcus shot back, his voice rising. You don't know what it was like, critics tearing me apart, producers telling me I wasn't marketable enough. Every door I opened led to another dead end. And every failure made you weaker, Grayson countered sharply. You stopped fighting, Marcus. You gave up. That's not the man I thought I was mentoring. Marcus clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. But beneath the anger was something deeper, a raw vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Maybe I wasn't strong enough, he admitted quietly. But maybe strength isn't always about pushing forward. Sometimes it's about knowing when to step back. Grayson studied him for a long moment, then sighed. You could have been great, Marcus. Don't forget that. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Marcus alone in the silence of the studio. The encounter left him shaken, forcing him to confront the doubts he'd buried deep within himself. Was Grayson right? Had he given up too easily? Meanwhile, across town, Victoria faced her own reckoning. Her father, Richard Lancaster, a towering figure in New York real estate, had summoned her to his penthouse office. Victoria, he began without preamble, gesturing for her to sit. I hear you're pouring money into some music venture. It's not just a venture, father, Victoria replied, keeping her tone even. It's a legacy. Mother's legacy. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, his expression skeptical. Elizabeth's legacy was teaching children how to play scales, not running a business. This isn't Connecticut, Victoria. It's Manhattan. People here don't care about passion projects, they care about results. The studio is producing results, Victoria argued, though she knew her father wouldn't be swayed easily. We have students, programs, community support. And debt, Richard interrupted. Do you know how much this little experiment of yours has cost? Enough to buy 3 properties in Tribeca. It's not about profit. Victoria snapped, her patience wearing thin. It's about giving people a chance, to create, to grow, to heal. Isn't that worth something? Richard's gaze hardened. Healing doesn't pay bills, Victoria. Passion doesn't put food on the table. If you insist on chasing these sentimental fantasies, don't expect me to bail you out when it all falls apart. The word stung, but Victoria refused to back down. Then I won't ask, she said firmly. This isn't about you, father. It's about honoring mother's memory, and helping someone like Marcus rediscover his purpose. Richard shook his head, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. Mark my words, Victoria. When this dream of yours collapses, don't come crying to me. As Victoria left the penthouse, her chest tightened with a mix of frustration and determination. She knew her father would never understand, he saw the world in terms of numbers and deals, not dreams and legacies. But she also knew she couldn't give up. Not now. Back at the studio, Marcus sat at the grand piano, staring at the keys. Grayson's words echoed in his mind, mingling with memories of his own failures. For so long, he'd told himself that stepping away from music was the right choice, that survival meant compromise. But now, surrounded by the hopeful faces of his students and the unwavering support of Victoria, he began to wonder if survival wasn't enough. Maybe it was time to stop running from the past, and start facing it head-on. Slowly, hesitantly, he pressed a key. Then another. And another. The melody that emerged was tentative at first, but soon it grew stronger, richer. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was honest. For the first time in years, Marcus allowed himself to believe that perhaps his story wasn't over. Perhaps it was just beginning. The air buzzed with anticipation as the Lancaster Music Studio prepared for its first-ever recital. It wasn't a grand affair, just a modest gathering of students, parents, and a few curious neighbors, but it felt monumental to everyone involved. For Marcus, it was more than just an event, it was a reckoning. A chance to step back into the spotlight, however small, and face the fears that had kept him in the shadows for so long. That evening, the studio's main hall was transformed. Strings of fairy lights twinkled above rows of folding chairs, and fresh flowers adorned the stage. At the center sat the grand piano, gleaming under the soft glow of overhead spotlights. Students milled about nervously, adjusting their sheet music or tuning their instruments, while Victoria moved among them, offering words of encouragement. Marcus stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold. His stomach churned with nerves, but there was something else too, a flicker of excitement he hadn't felt in years. He'd agreed to close the recital with a solo performance, a decision that terrified him even now. But as he glanced at the eager faces of his students, he reminded himself why he'd said yes. This wasn't just about him, it was about showing them that courage could be contagious. As the recital began, the room fell silent. One by one, the students took the stage, their performances ranging from shaky but heartfelt to surprisingly polished. Each note they played seemed to breathe new life into the space, filling it with hope and possibility. When the final student finished, Victoria stepped forward to address the audience. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said, her voice warm and steady. "This studio represents more than just music, it's a place where dreams can take root and grow. And no one embodies that spirit more than our director, Marcus Carter." A ripple of applause spread through the room as Marcus made his way to the stage. The spotlight hit him, bright and unrelenting, and for a moment, he froze. Memories of past performances flooded back, the standing ovations, the harsh critiques, the crushing silences when opportunities slipped away. But then he saw Victoria standing near the piano, her expression calm yet encouraging. Behind her were his students, their eyes wide with admiration and trust. In that moment, Marcus realized this wasn't Carnegie Hall or Lincoln Center. It was a room full of people who believed in him, not because of what he'd achieved, but because of who he was trying to become. He took a deep breath and approached the microphone. "This song means a lot to me," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "It's called Hallelujah, and it reminds me that even in our darkest moments, there's beauty worth finding." With that, he turned to the piano and began to play. The opening chords were soft and hesitant, like whispers rising from the depths of memory. Then, slowly, his voice joined in, a rich, soulful baritone that filled the room with raw emotion. The audience listened in stunned silence, captivated by the honesty in his delivery. Tears glistened in some eyes, while others simply closed theirs, letting the music wash over them. Even Victoria, standing at the edge of the stage, found herself caught up in the moment. And then, something unexpected happened. As Marcus reached the bridge of the song, Victoria stepped forward and sat down at the piano beside him. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a brief second before joining his melody, weaving harmonies that elevated the piece to something transcendent. For Victoria, it was a moment of reconnection. She hadn't played publicly since her mother's passing, too afraid of failing to live up to Elizabeth's legacy. But sitting there beside Marcus, she felt none of the fear or self-doubt that had haunted her for years. Instead, she felt free, as if the music itself was carrying her forward. Together, they brought the song to its crescendo, their voices blending seamlessly in a tapestry of sound and emotion. When the final note faded, the room erupted into applause, not polite clapping, but thunderous cheers that echoed off the walls. Marcus stood, visibly shaken, and looked out at the audience. For the first time in years, he didn't see critics or skeptics. He saw people who cared, not about perfection, but about authenticity. Victoria rose from the piano bench and joined him at the microphone. "I think I speak for everyone here when I say, thank you, Marcus," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Tonight proves that music isn't just about talent, it's about connection. And I'm honored to share this journey with all of you." As the applause continued, Marcus glanced at Victoria, gratitude shining in his eyes. "You didn't tell me you could play like that," he whispered, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "There's a lot we don't know about each other yet," Victoria replied softly. "But maybe that's part of the fun." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter and celebration. Parents congratulated their children, students hugged Marcus, and Victoria fielded questions from neighbors intrigued by the studio's mission. For both Marcus and Victoria, the night marked a turning point. For Marcus, it was proof that he still had a voice worth hearing, and that sharing it could inspire others to find theirs. For Victoria, it was a reminder that her mother's legacy wasn't just about preserving the past, it was about creating a future where art could thrive. As the last guests left and the lights dimmed, Marcus lingered on the stage, running his fingers over the piano keys. "You did it," Victoria said, joining him once more. "We did it," Marcus corrected, meeting her gaze. For the first time in years, neither of them felt alone. Together, they had taken the first steps toward healing, not just for themselves, but for everyone whose lives the studio touched. The glow of the recital had barely faded when reality came crashing back. It started with an email, a curt, impersonal message from one of the studio's largest investors. Due to unforeseen circumstances, it read, "We regret to inform you that we must withdraw our financial support effective immediately." Victoria stared at the screen, her heart sinking as the words blurred before her eyes. The investor had promised stability, a lifeline to keep the studio afloat while they built momentum. Without their backing, the future suddenly felt precarious. She called Marcus into her office later that afternoon, the weight of the news heavy on her shoulders. "We have a problem," she said simply, handing him a printout of the email. Marcus scanned the document, his brow furrowing with concern. "This is not good," he muttered, setting the paper down. "How much of a hit are we looking at?" "Enough to derail everything," Victoria admitted, leaning back in her chair. "Rent, utilities, payroll, it's all on shaky ground now. If we don't find another source of funding soon," she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "What about your father? Could he?" "No," Victoria interrupted firmly. "He made it clear where he stands. Asking him again would only make things worse." For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was thick with unspoken fears and mounting pressure. Finally, Marcus broke it. "I could go back to waiting tables," he said quietly. "Full-time, I mean. At least until we get back on solid footing." Victoria looked up sharply. "You can't be serious." "It's practical," Marcus replied, his tone resigned. "I've done it before, I can do it again. It's not like I haven't spent years suppressing my dreams anyway." "That's not fair, to yourself or to the students," Victoria countered, her voice rising slightly. "They look up to you, Marcus. You're the reason this place exists. Walking away now would destroy everything we've worked for. And staying will destroy me if I can't pay my bills." Marcus shot back, frustration spilling over. "You think I don't want to fight for this? Of course I do. But fighting isn't enough when the odds are stacked against us." His outburst hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. For a moment, Victoria didn't know how to respond. She'd always admired Marcus's quiet strength, but seeing him unravel like this was painful, and eye-opening. "You're right," she said finally, her voice softer. "We're up against a lot. But giving up isn't the answer, not for you, and not for me." "Then what is?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "Because I'm running out of ideas." Victoria stood and paced the room, her mind racing. "There has to be another way. Fundraisers, grants, crowdfunding campaigns, we'll explore every option. And if none of that works, she paused, turning to face him. Then we'll figure something else out. Together. Her determination was palpable, but Marcus couldn't shake the gnawing sense of doubt. Later that night, as he walked home through the quiet streets of Brooklyn, he replayed their conversation in his head. He knew Victoria meant well, but the truth was, sacrifices would have to be made, and he wasn't sure he had any left to give. When he arrived at his apartment, he opened the closet and pulled out his old waiter's uniform. The fabric felt stiff and unfamiliar after months of wearing casual clothes to teach and rehearse. As he held it in his hands, memories flooded back, the endless shifts, the polite smiles masking exhaustion, the constant reminder that he was living someone else's dream instead of his own. But then he thought about the studio. About Jamal, Sophia, and the other students who relied on him. About Victoria, who had risked so much to give him a second chance. Could he really walk away from all of that? Marcus sank onto the edge of his bed, staring at the uniform in silence. For the first time in years, he didn't have an easy answer. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the studio to find an unexpected sight. A small group of neighbors had gathered outside, carrying boxes, tools, and even a few musical instruments. At the center of it all was Sophia's mother, Maria, a local bakery owner who had become one of the studio's most vocal supporters. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," Maria said with a warm smile as Marcus approached. "We heard about your situation. Thought you might need a hand." Marcus blinked in disbelief. "You heard? How?" "Word travels fast in this neighborhood," Maria replied with a shrug. "Besides, we see what this place means to our kids. It's not just a music studio, it's hope. And we're not about to let that go without a fight." Behind her, others began unloading their donations. A retired carpenter offered to fix the studio's creaky floorboards. A graphic designer volunteered to create flyers for a community fundraiser. Even Jamal's older brother showed up with a stack of second-hand sheet music he'd collected from friends. Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched the scene unfold. For so long, he'd carried the weight of the studio on his own shoulders, convinced that asking for help was a sign of weakness. But now, surrounded by people eager to lend a hand, he realized how wrong he'd been. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "All of you. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Maria said gently. "Just keep doing what you're doing. That's thanks enough." Inside the studio, Victoria was equally overwhelmed. She'd spent the past few days reaching out to every contact she could think of, but nothing had prepared her for the outpouring of support from the community. As she organized supplies and coordinated volunteers, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. The name on the screen made her heart skip a beat, Richard Lancaster. She hesitated before answering, bracing herself for another lecture. "Father," she said cautiously. "What is it?" "I've been thinking," Richard began, his tone unusually subdued. "About the studio. And your mother." Victoria frowned, unsure where this was going. "Okay. I may have underestimated its value," Richard admitted gruffly. "Elizabeth always believed music could change lives. Maybe she was right." Victoria's breath caught in her chest. This was the closest thing to an apology she'd ever received from him. "So what does that mean?" she asked carefully. "It means I'll make some calls," Richard replied. "See if I can rally a few colleagues to contribute. Not because I believe in fairy tales, mind you, but because it seems important to you." Tears welled up in Victoria's eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. "Thank you, Father. That means a lot." "Don't mention it," Richard said briskly, clearly uncomfortable with the sentimentality. "Just don't waste the opportunity." When the call ended, Victoria sat quietly for a moment, letting the weight of her father's words sink in. For years, she'd resented his disapproval, his inability to see beyond profit margins and property values. But now, she saw something else, a man trying, in his own flawed way, to understand. By evening, the studio buzzed with activity. Volunteers painted walls, repaired furniture, and set up equipment donated by local businesses. Marcus worked alongside them, his earlier doubts replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Victoria joined him near the grand piano, where they paused to survey the progress. "This is incredible," Marcus said, shaking his head in amazement. "I never imagined." "That's the thing about communities," Victoria interrupted with a small smile. "They surprise you when you least expect it." "And families, too," Marcus added, nodding toward her phone. Victoria chuckled softly. "Even stubborn ones." For the first time in weeks, the future didn't feel quite so daunting. The financial challenges weren't gone, they still loomed large, but they no longer seemed insurmountable. With the support of the neighborhood and her father's connections, there was a real chance to keep the studio alive. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light through the windows, Marcus sat down at the piano and began to play. The melody was simple but heartfelt, a quiet tribute to everyone who had stepped up to help. Victoria listened silently, her arms crossed over her chest. When the final note faded, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "my mother used to say that music wasn't just sound, it was connection. Proof that we're never truly alone." Marcus nodded, meeting her gaze. "She was right. Because of her, and because of you, we're building something bigger than ourselves." Together, they stood in the glow of the studio, surrounded by laughter, music, and the hum of shared effort. For the first time in a long while, both Marcus and Victoria allowed themselves to believe, not just in the studio, but in the power of resilience, unity, and second chances. The night of the grand reopening arrived with an air of anticipation that seemed to electrify the entire neighborhood. The Lancaster Music Studio had been transformed into a space that radiated warmth and elegance. Twinkling fairy lights framed the entrance, while fresh flowers adorned every surface inside. The scent of polished wood mingled with the faint aroma of Maria's donated pastries, which were arranged on a long table near the back. Guests began arriving shortly after sunset, local business owners, parents of students, curious neighbors, and even a few influential figures Richard Lancaster had convinced to attend. Among them were journalists, philanthropists, and arts advocates, all eager to see what this little studio in Brooklyn had become. Marcus stood near the piano, adjusting his tie for the 100th time. He felt out of place amidst the suits and evening gowns, but Victoria appeared at his side before he could retreat into self-doubt. "You look great," she said with a reassuring smile. "Stop fidgeting." "I'm not cut out for this," Marcus muttered under his breath. "I should be backstage, not shaking hands with strangers." "Tonight isn't about you being uncomfortable," Victoria replied firmly. "It's about showing the world what we've built together. Trust me, you'll do fine." Before Marcus could respond, Richard Lancaster entered the room, flanked by two associates. His presence commanded attention, though his demeanor was unusually subdued. As he approached Victoria and Marcus, there was a flicker of pride in his eyes, a rare glimpse of vulnerability beneath his usual stoicism. "This looks impressive," Richard admitted, glancing around the room. "You've done well, Victoria." "Thank you, Father," Victoria said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. Richard turned to Marcus, extending a hand. "And you, Mr. Carter. My daughter speaks highly of your dedication. Keep it up." Marcus shook his hand, momentarily speechless. It wasn't exactly praise, but coming from Richard, it might as well have been. As the evening progressed, the energy in the room grew infectious. Guests mingled over glasses of sparkling cider, marveling at student performances scattered throughout the space. Sophia played a hauntingly beautiful violin solo, while Jamal accompanied her on the piano, their collaboration earning thunderous applause. When the crowd settled into seats for the main event, Victoria stepped forward to address them. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "This studio represents more than just music, it's a testament to resilience, community, and the belief that art has the power to heal. Tonight, we honor my mother, Elizabeth Lancaster, whose love for music inspired everything you see here. And we celebrate Marcus Carter, whose courage and talent have brought this vision to life." The audience erupted into applause as Marcus rose from his seat and walked to the stage. He hadn't planned to perform tonight, not like this, but something in Victoria's words stirred a deep resolve within him. He sat down at the grand piano and took a moment to collect himself. Then, without explanation, he began to play. The piece was one he'd learned as a child, a classical composition dedicated to his late grandmother, a woman who had taught him his first notes and encouraged his dreams when no one else would. The melody was intricate yet tender, each note imbued with memories of laughter, lessons, and love. As Marcus played, the room fell silent, captivated by the raw emotion pouring from the keys. Tears glistened in Victoria's eyes as she watched him, realizing how much this moment meant, not just to Marcus, but to everyone who had ever felt unseen or unheard. When the final chord faded, the audience erupted into a standing ovation. Marcus stood slowly, bowing his head in gratitude. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of failure or fear. Instead, he felt whole. After the applause subsided, Victoria joined him on stage, her expression radiant. "That was breathtaking," she whispered as they embraced. "It was for her," Marcus replied quietly, nodding toward the framed photograph of Elizabeth Lancaster that now hung prominently on the wall. Victoria followed his gaze, her heart swelling with emotion. In that moment, she felt closer to her mother than she had in years. Not because of the legacy Elizabeth had left behind, but because of the new one they were creating together, one rooted in hope, connection, and the transformative power of music. As the night drew to a close, guests lingered, reluctant to leave the magic of the studio. Marcus and Victoria stood side by side, watching as Jamal and Sophia led a group of younger students in an impromptu jam session. "We did it," Victoria said softly, leaning against Marcus's shoulder. "No," Marcus corrected, smiling faintly. "We're just getting started." Together, they looked out at the vibrant scene before them, a living, breathing testament to the idea that even in the face of adversity, beauty could rise. 1 year later, the Lancaster Music Studio had become a cornerstone of the Brooklyn community. What had once been a neglected relic was now a vibrant hub of creativity and connection. Students poured in daily, their laughter and music spilling onto the streets. The walls were adorned with new photographs, snapshots of performances, workshops, and moments of triumph both big and small. Marcus stood in the main hall early one morning, sipping coffee as sunlight streamed through the windows. He wore his signature vest, though these days it wasn't for waiting tables, it was part of his uniform as the studio's director. Around him, volunteers bustled about preparing for the day's activities, a masterclass for advanced vocalists, a beginner's piano lesson, and an after-school program for kids eager to explore their musical talents. As he glanced at the schedule pinned to the bulletin board, a soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Carter," came a hesitant voice from the doorway. Marcus turned to see a young girl standing there, no older than 10, clutching a battered violin case. Her name was Lily, one of the newest students. She reminded him so much of himself at that age, shy, uncertain, but brimming with potential. "Yes, Lily?" Marcus asked warmly, setting down his mug. I was wondering," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Could I practice here? Just for a little while? My mom says we can't afford lessons yet, but," she trailed off, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Marcus knelt down to meet her eye level, his expression kind. "Lily, this studio isn't just for people who can pay. It's for anyone who loves music. If you want to practice, you're always welcome here. Her face lit up with relief and gratitude. Really? Thank you, Mr. Carter. I promise I'll work hard. I know you will, Marcus replied with a smile. Now go ahead, make this place sing. As Lily hurried to set up near the corner, Marcus straightened and watched her unpack her violin. Memories flooded back, of his own childhood, when he'd begged his grandmother to let him play on her old piano, promising to take care of it like it was his own. Back then, he hadn't realized how much those early opportunities would shape his life. Now, seeing Lily's determination, he understood the ripple effect of even the smallest acts of kindness. Later that afternoon, Victoria arrived, carrying a stack of papers detailing upcoming events and partnerships. Over the past year, she'd grown into her role as co-founder, balancing her real estate empire with her passion for the studio. "How's everything going?" she asked, joining Marcus by the window. "Better than I ever imagined," Marcus admitted, gesturing toward the bustling room. "Look at them, Victoria. They're fearless. Hungry. It reminds me of why we started this." Victoria followed his gaze, her lips curving into a proud smile. "You've done more than just run a studio, Marcus. You've given these kids a chance to dream bigger than they thought possible. And you've helped me believe in mine again," Marcus said quietly. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Victoria shook her head, brushing off the compliment. "This isn't about us. It's about what happens next, for them." She nodded toward Lily, who was now playing a tentative but heartfelt rendition of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. The melody wavered occasionally, but there was something pure and unguarded about it, a reminder that beginnings are often messy, yet full of promise. That evening, as the last student left and the lights dimmed, Marcus lingered in the empty hall. He sat down at the grand piano, running his fingers over the keys. For a moment, he simply listened, to the echoes of laughter, applause, and countless melodies that had filled the space over the past year. Then, softly, he began to play. The piece was one he'd written recently, inspired by the journey he and Victoria had shared. It started slow and contemplative, building into a triumphant crescendo that seemed to capture the essence of second chances, the pain, the struggle, and ultimately, the hope. Victoria appeared in the doorway, watching silently as the final notes faded into the stillness. "That was beautiful," she said, stepping closer. "What's it called?" "A New Beginning," Marcus replied, smiling faintly. It felt fitting. "It is," Victoria agreed, sitting beside him on the bench. "Not just for you, but for everyone who walks through these doors." They sat together in comfortable silence, reflecting on how far they'd come. From a chance encounter at the Golden Fork to a thriving studio that touched lives every day, their partnership had rewritten not only their own futures but the futures of countless others. As they locked up and stepped out into the cool night air, Marcus paused to glance back at the glowing sign above the entrance, Lancaster Music Studio. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "your mother would be proud." Victoria smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She already is." And with that, they walked away, leaving behind a legacy built on resilience, trust, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserves a second chance, and that music has the power to uplift, heal, and transform. So, what can we take away from Marcus and Victoria's journey? At its heart, this story is about second chances, the kind that come when we least expect them, often disguised as challenges or setbacks. It reminds us that our gifts, no matter how buried they may seem, have the power to change not only our lives but the lives of others. For Marcus, it was rediscovering his voice, not just as a singer, but as a leader and mentor. For Victoria, it was honoring her mother's legacy by creating something meaningful, something that would outlast her own doubts and fears. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: none of us are meant to face our struggles alone. Whether it's a community coming together to save a studio, a father reconciling with his daughter, or a young girl finding courage in a battered violin, connection is what keeps us moving forward. When we lift each other up, we create opportunities for growth, healing, and transformation. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own battles, triumphs, or dreams waiting to be reignited, we'd love for you to join us on this journey. Our channel is dedicated to bringing you stories like this one, tales of resilience, hope, and the extraordinary potential within ordinary people. Don't miss out on the next chapter. Subscribe now and be part of a community that believes in the power of storytelling to inspire change. Because who knows? The next story might just be the one you've been waiting for. Until then, remember, every ending holds the seed of a new beginning. Keep believing, keep creating, and above all, keep sharing your gifts with the world. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.